within 24 hours. Within 24 hours, if we plan surgery, we can't start beta blockers, but before that, we can start beta blockers. And statins, even within 24 hours of surgery, we start statins. They say it gives survival benefit. And as I mentioned earlier, this patient is on clopidogrel and aspirin, dual ventilator therapy. So we don't further much about aspirin, but it's better to stop clopidogrel 5 to 7 days prior to surgery if this is not an emergency surgery. So this is not an emergency, it's urgent surgery. So what we can do is we can stop clopidogrel for 5 to 7 days and continue the aspirin. And next thing is, since this patient is having recent non-STEMI history, we have to assess the cardiac function. So what we have to do is we have to get done a 2D echo. So we can assess the ejection fraction and how about the left ventricular function. And also we have to, with the ECG, usually sometimes these patients get ongoing ischemia. So we have to do 2D echo as well as ECG. And we can compare the ECG with all ECGs. If the ECGs are not dynamic, if there is no dynamic changes, it will be all right. But anyway, we have to assess the ejection fraction. Because with the ejection fraction, intraoperatively, the anesthetic drugs what we are using, we have to titrate according to the ejection fraction. And since it's a major surgery, we have to reserve an ICU bed. So when after assessing all these things, the first thing we have to do all the basic investigation. So what are the basic investigation? We have to do imaging as well as blood investigation. So blood investigation, we have to do full blood count. That is to check the hemoglobin. So what is the target hemoglobin for patients who are waiting for surgery with ischemic heart disease? It is 9. Usually for other patients, if the patient doesn't have any comorbidities, the cutoff value for the hemoglobin for anesthesia, it is 7. But for ischemic heart disease, all the time we have to maintain above 9. That is to maintain the myocardial oxygen supply. And we have to do blood urea, serum electrolyte, creatinine, because this is long-term standing diabetes, and these patients are high risk of getting nephropathy and chronic kidney disease. So we can assess renal functions with that. And also, since this is a major surgery, we have to PTINR, clotting profile, and apart from that, chest X-ray. And we have to regularly check the blood sugar. And other thing, with all the investigation prior to surgery, we have to again assess this patient as anesthetic wise. So do all the basic investigation, and it's better if we can do HbA1c to check the long-term diabetic control, and do 2D echo, that is to assess the cardiac function, and other blood investigations, blood count, blood urea, electrolyte, creatinine, and ECG. We have to, if the patient has got previous ECG, better to get down these ECGs, because we can compare the ECG changes with the new ECG. If those changes are old, it's we can consider as no dynamic changes. But if the patient already having some ECG changes, better to repeat the ECG within few hours or the next day, because we can assess whether it is the changes are old or it is dynamic. And after that, what you have to do is, on the day of one day prior to surgery, it's better to start anxiolytics. So patients with ischemic heart disease, anytime they can get ischemic event. So even slight anxiety, it causes myocardial, the tachycardia, and reduce the myocardial oxygen delivery, and oxygen consumption will be high with the tachycardia. So anytime they can get ischemic events. So better to start anxiolytic such as diazepam usually we give 5 milligrams Nocte, and other than that, we can give Naloxone and omeprazole because this is a long-standing diabetes. These patients are high risk of GORD, gastroesophageal reflux disease. So to prevent that, we give prokinetic as well as H2 receptor or proton pump inhibitor. And we have to check the ICU bed availability. Definitely, this patient needs ICU bed. And we have to plan this surgery as first case. One thing is a diabetic patient and major surgery and a lot of comorbidities. So we have to discuss with the surgical team and anesthetic team and plan for do it as a first case. And other thing we have to get deep. Yes.
Yeah. Okay, you continue. Yeah. Before we go to the next thing, that I would just want to ask, which clinical status do you change oral hypoglycemic agent to soluble insulin before the surgery, preoperatively?
Yeah. If this says it is type 2 diabetes, and usually if it is an emergency surgery, we don't have much time to control with oral agents. We don't have days, but only we have hours. So in that case, definitely we have to go for soluble insulin. This is, the blood sugar, if it say it is 400 or 500, something like that, if it comes as high index, definitely we have to go for soluble insulin. But this patient, it is 255. So it is not so high. This level, we can control with oral hypoglycemic agent. And the other thing I forgot to tell, it's better to do ketone bodies because this is poor control with no proper follow-up. So if the ketone body is positive, that means patient is having ketoacidosis. In that case, anyway, we have to go for soluble insulin. Other than that, usually these type of patients can be controlled with oral hypoglycemic agents.
Can I ask another question without going to the other section? With after the anesthetize this patient after the post-operatively with residual anesthetic effect, what is the rationale of restarting antihypertensive drugs in post-operatively once he come into the ward after the ICU management?
We have to start because we have to control the blood pressure. Both hypotension and hypertension detrimental for patients with ischemic heart disease. We should not allow rapid fluctuation of blood pressure if the patient is having history of ischemic heart disease. So if the blood pressure is shooting up, usually the target level is with comorbidities, these are multiple comorbidities with ischemic heart disease. What we go is usually blood pressure should be maintained less than 130/80. So if to achieve this blood pressure, if the blood pressure is shooting up, we have to give the antihypertensive treatment. And if the blood pressure is dropping with the antihypertensive treatment, we have to withhold these drugs temporarily.
Another thing is to control the blood pressure, not only the medication, the other hand side, we need to control the pain and all other things that can increase the heart rate and those things, right?
Yeah, that is post-operative.
Post-operative.
Yes.
Yeah. Dr. Upasinghe, there's a question from the audience.
Okay.
So, if you suggest any additional things if microvascular reconstruction is planned at this time?
That is that means flap.
Yeah.
One thing is if the hemoglobin is in the high level, we have to do the fluid resuscitation. We have to hydrate the patient because we have to prevent the thrombosis. So one thing is that, and other thing, we have to avoid the pain, because with the pain it will increase the adrenaline level and it causes increased vasoconstriction and vasospasm.
Other thing is, if you go for the fibula flap, so better to do sometimes as we don't have the facility to do the angiogram, we don't do it, but it's better to assess properly as it is described in the textbook, because this long-term diabetes can affect the macrovascular vessels. So because of that, it is better to do the full list of investigation to assess the vascularity of these the flaps at the surgical point of view. Because when you don't have the facility, sometimes we go for the clinical test.
What are the criteria for dual antiplatelet therapy? If the patient is going normally, what are the criteria? If the patient is ischemic heart disease, what are the criteria for dual antiplatelet therapy? Or the
That
most
means
of the
to continue.
yes, to continue.
If the, if the patient is
going to
having history of stenting,
yes.
If they have, I mean, the bare metal stent or the drug-eluting, usually, if the patient is on drug-eluting stent, we have to continue the dual antiplatelet therapy for at least 1 year. Continue both drugs. The indication is, I mean, usually the stents. But according to the history, this patient has not undergone any stenting or primary PCI or any, I mean, the interventions. So in this case, we don't have to continue both drugs. Only aspirin will be enough. I mean, during the perioperative period.
And what is your extubation plan for this patient after the surgery, long hours, 6 to 8 hours surgery?
Yeah, as I mentioned, this patient definitely need ICU bed. What we usually do is, I mean, overnight we ventilate this patient, keep the tube with sedation. We don't need any paralysis. We use good sedation and analgesics. And usually overnight we ventilate this patient, and following day morning we extubate, because we have to give time to, I mean, reduce the edema, and we have to check the any surgical site bleeding, any laryngeal edema or anything. If there is no any complication, we can extubate the following day morning.
Can you explain the preemptive and post-operative multimodal analgesia as a part of enhanced recovery protocol?
Yeah. So what do you mean by preemptive analgesia? That is, we start analgesic before onset of painful stimuli. So that prevents sensitization of nervous system. So it reduces the subsequent analgesic requirement. So what we do is, before we start the surgery, before the patient feels pain, we give, usually we can start paracetamol before the surgery. And as well as multimodal analgesia, what we can do is, we can use local anesthetic agents or nerve blocks during the surgery. I mean, at the end of the surgery. So it will reduce the post-operative opioid requirement. So if you use multiple, I mean, the combination of analgesic agents, it will reduce the complications. I mean, the side effects of the drugs. So with low dose, we can achieve good pain relief, and patient will be pain-free and comfortable.
Can you explain the fluid resuscitation of the fasting patient, and pre-operatively and post-operatively, and the selection of the resuscitation fluid? And please explain, when do you consider the blood transfusion?
Yes. First, I will start with the blood transfusion. As I mentioned earlier, patients with ischemic heart disease awaiting for surgery, our target is hemoglobin above 9 grams per deciliter. To achieve the threshold, I mean, this level, we have to transfuse even during the surgery or pre-operatively. We can't anesthetize if the HB level is less than 9. And post-operatively also, all the time we have to repeat the full blood count, and to achieve that level, we have to give blood. And fluid, usually we don't go for like early surgeries, we don't go for prolonged fasting. Usually, fasting is for solid, it is 6 hours, and for clear fluids, it is 2 hours. Usually, even 2 hours prior to surgery, we can give clear fluids. Even plain tea will be all right. That is, we have to avoid prolonged fasting, especially patients with diabetes. So, unlike early days, we don't, all the patients, we don't need preoperative IV fluid, but if you want to keep prolonged fasting, better to start IV fluids, that is Hartmann or normal saline. You have to give the maintenance, that is 1.5 mils per kg per hour. And post-operative also, if the HB is low, we can transfuse blood to achieve threshold, that is 9 grams per deciliter, and maintenance fluid, that is Hartmann's or normal saline, that is also 1.5 mils per kg per hour. And all the time we have to repeat the full blood count and do the electrolyte, and depending on that, we have to correct the electrolytes.
And how do you achieve nutritional optimization for this patient? Can't hear.
Hello, can you hear?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now can.
Yeah. Sorry. So it's better to this patients with malignancy. So we have to optimize the nutrition level. So what we do is we can start high protein diets for these patients, and high protein and high energy. Usually, if the hospital has any dietitians or nutritionist, we can get their opinion for the diet plan, or else what we can go for high protein diet for this patient. And post-operative also, we don't keep this patient fasting. Usually after extubation, 3-4 hours after extubation, we can start feeding. And usually during the surgery, we have to put the NG tube, and we can start the NG feeding after 3-4 hours after extubation. So that also we can go for high protein liquid diet.
Before we go to the other topic, can you elaborate what is the glycemic control in the ICU and the ward setup with the algorithm and the sliding scale?
Yeah, so ICU setup, we go for the algorithm. So every hour we check the blood sugar, and depending on the blood sugar, they have given the insulin, the infusion, what is the rate. So ICU target is, as I mentioned earlier, the perioperative, the anesthetic, as anesthetist, our target is less than 100 milligrams per deciliter. So the range is we maintain between 120 to 180 milligrams per deciliter. We don't go for tight control, because they have done so many researchers. They have found ICU mortality and morbidity is so high with tight control. So we go for the liberal control. So ICU definitely will go for algorithm. There are 3, 1, 2, 3. So depending on the blood sugar, we can start. That means we start the insulin infusion, but most importantly, we have to check the blood sugar every hour. So you have to have the resources to check the blood sugar and close monitoring of this patient. In ward setup, best thing is to go for the sliding scale. And once the patient is stable, we can restart the oral hypoglycemic agents. So immediate post-op period, we don't start oral hypoglycemic, especially the ICU patients. But once the patient is sent to the ward, initially you can go for sliding scale, and once the patient is stabilized, you can, if the patient's feeding has restarted, blood sugar is under control with insulin, you can slowly restart the oral hypoglycemic agent.
And can you explain what are the guidelines for mechanical and therapeutic surgical DVT prophylaxis in major OMF surgeries? What are the criteria to continue DVT prophylaxis post-operative?
DVT prophylaxis, we can go for either pharmacological or non-pharmacological. The pharmacological things are, we can start enoxaparin or tinzaparin. Usually in Sri Lanka, what we do is we start enoxaparin if there is no surgical bleeding and if the platelet and coagulation profile is okay, we can start enoxaparin prophylactic dose. That is, dose is 0.5 milligrams per kg once daily dose. And apart from that, during the surgery, what we can do is we can hydrate the patient, and post-operative also we have to hydrate the patient, avoid dehydration, and we can use DVT stocking, TED stockings, that is thromboembolic tetra stockings, or the calf pumps. So even during this intraoperatively and postoperatively, we can use this either pharmacological or non-pharmacological. Pharmacological one will be the enoxaparin or tinzaparin, or non-pharmacological will be TED stockings and the compression devices. And other thing, we can hydrate the patient. Early mobilization is very important, especially these patients with malignancy. They are high risk of getting DVTs. So as early as possible, we have to mobilize the patient and start these drugs. And main thing, we have to always check the coagulation profile and the surgical bleeding. There is bleeding or platelet is low and ANR is high, it's better not to give pharmacological agents, better to go for non-pharmacological methods.
Post-operative day 3, this patient developed STEMI. How do you diagnose and manage this medical emergency?
With diabetes, usually these patients get silent MI. Usually these patients, they don't complain of chest pain. What we do is when we do chest, I mean the ECG, or if the patient's blood pressure is dropping only, we investigate this patient, then we can find the ECG changes. So especially the patients with diabetes and ischemic heart disease, regularly we have to do ECGs. If the ECG shows dynamic changes, that means ongoing ischemia is happening. So what we have to do is, first thing, if you suspect STEMI or any cardiac ischemia, we have to give oxygen and maintain saturation above 98. And the main thing is give good pain relief, because it precipitates ischemia. So if the patient complains of surgical site pain, better to give analgesics, especially morphine. There is no contraindication. And other thing, always we have to control the blood pressure. We have to avoid the drastic blood pressure control. So do ECG and do troponin I. No point in, I mean, if patient complain of chest pain, no point in as early as possible do the troponin, because it takes some time to increase the blood troponin level. So send troponin level, and next thing should be you have to get medical or cardiology opinion. And usually, if you suspect this STEMI, you have to give stat doses of aspirin 300 milligram and atorvastatin. Either you can go for low dose or high dose. Low dose, that is, you can give 40 milligrams or up to 80 milligrams. You can give statins. After giving these drugs, you can get the medical or cardiology opinion, and don't forget to give the good pain relief and also check the hemoglobin level, because those are the things that precipitate myocardial ischemia. And always consider silent MI in diabetic patients. And if the patient's saturation is on air, it is 100%, no point in giving oxygen. What they say is, if you give too much oxygen, it generates free radicals. It will further damage myocardium. So if the patient's saturation is maintaining, no point in, I mean, if it is above 98, no point in giving extra oxygen.
Okay, thank you very much. Then since you want to leave the Zoom, that you have a urgent thing to attend, on behalf of the college, I'll take a big thank to you, Dr. Krishan Rupasena, for your information, knowledge, and your especially the time. Thank you very much. We would like if you can stay in the Zoom as you can stay, that then
yeah,
can attend
actually
your thing.
extremely sorry because I have to attend an urgent surgery.
Yes.
So extremely sorry for that. Thank you very much, all of you, and extremely sorry I have to leave early. Thank you very much for your cooperation and inviting me for this Zoom session.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Krishan.
Thank you.
Thank you, Abhisingh. Thank you.
Thank you, Krishan.
And next question is to Dr. Abhisingh. As a OMF surgeon, in the OMF surgeon's point of view, how do you assess this patient preoperatively, and what is your special investigations?
So, as a surgeon, so in this patient, not only this medical condition, we need to assess they have already assessed the primary lesion in the tongue. So then we need to assess local, regional, and the distance metastasis first. Those are the investigation that we have to do in relation to the lesion itself. So to assess the local and the regional, that means the neck, so we have to have some images like plain X-rays, OPG, CT scan. To assess the regional, if we have the facilities, we can go for CT scan, MRI, and the ultrasound scan, ultrasound scan in the neck bilaterally to assess the regional metastasis. So plain X-ray and the CT scan will give you whether there's any bony involvement, though it is mentioned as lateral tongue lesion. And to assess the distance metastasis, especially, and for the assessment of the general anesthesia as well, we have to have the chest X-ray. So if you are going for any other reconstruction option for this, for example, radial forearm, then you need to specially assess the donor site especially for the vascularity. So those are the special investigation that need to think about assessing the lesions as well as the metastasis and the reconstructions if you are going to do any flap. So as Krishan mentioned, we need to assess all the system because as he said, this patient can get macro and microvascular complications. Apart from that, so if the patient is nutritionally at low level, we have to get the opinion from the nutritionist, and we need to improve the level of nutrition in this patient because that dramatically affect the wound healing and the hospital stay, postoperative infections, and the number of days this patient have to stay in the hospital. And so the postoperatively, the other the management options such as referral to the oncology team to the further treatment for this type of patient.
Can you
yeah. So Krishan, other thing is Krishan mentioned this. Yeah. Tanu, you continue.
Yeah. Can you explain the current guideline for antibiotic prophylaxis for OMF surgical patients?
Yeah. If you consider this patient, for this patient, we don't need any antibiotic prophylaxis. If you can start the IV antibiotic at the beginning of the induction of the anesthesia, that is more than enough. Otherwise, the patient is the other surgeries like not like in OMF surgery, neurological surgeries, especially in the orthopedic surgeries, they need to have the prophylaxis. And other than that, the patient is having any previous history of the myocardial, the infective endocarditis, any valvular disease, or any other deformity in the heart, we need to start the antibiotic prophylaxis And then we need to think about whether this patient in the regular antibiotic prophylaxis or what type of antibiotic he's having, and whether this patient in the allergies to any other antibiotic. If you consider this patient, it is more than enough to have the IV antibiotic, start IV antibiotic at the time of induction of this patient.
Can you explain about the type of surgical drains and management and factors considering the removal of the drains?
Yeah. So the drains in the head and neck region, especially the evidence for what type of drains should be used and when to remove, how much pressure, what are the type of drains. If you go to the literature, the evidence are very, very low. So aim of placing drain in the surgical patient is to reduce the hematoma and the formation of the seroma, and this hematoma and the seroma indirectly affect the wound, delay the wound healing, and then the wound dehiscence, post-operative infections, and the increased hospital stay. So prevent those things. The head and neck region, most of the time we use drains, but that has to be done by considering each and every patient separately. And then you need to consider so many factors, whether this patient is having risk of bleeding, or whether this patient, the surgery is, for example, if you consider parotidectomy, one parotidectomy may be vary from the other, right? So you need to think individual patients separately rather than just routinely go and place the drain each and every surgery. For the hemiglossectomy and the neck dissection, yes, you need to place the drain because that carries a lot of advantages. Because if you develop any hematoma in the neck, that can directly affect the airway obstruction, and there can be due to this formation of big hematoma that can delay the wound healing, and it can cause the infection. So when you select the drain, there are two types of drains, either closed or open drains. That means suction drain. So especially in the head and neck region, most of the time we use the suction drain. So then come the questions, how much suction you are going to apply for this. So if you apply more suction, then you can suck the capillary blood from the capillaries, and then the following day you will see the more blood in the drain. So then you have to decide how much pressure you are going to apply. So that comes with the experience. There are no guideline how much suction you are going to apply. So if you are going to apply the suction, then it is better to apply the minimum suction, because that can cause the discomfort to the patient. And if you are going to keep this suction for a long time, then this suction tube itself can create the pathway for infection. So if you are going to keep this suction for a long time, then it will result in infection. So then you need to think about how long you are going to keep this suction. So there are two criteria you need to think, either the number of days or amount of the fluid that has been filled in the suction tube. So then you need to think about not only the how much, but are the type of secretion. If you see it carries the pure blood, that means you need to keep this suction drain for few more days. So normally in our setup, once we apply the drain, until patient is fully mobilized, we keep the drain intact, and when it comes to say around 20-30 milliliters, you can remove the drain. There won't be any complication. But this comes with your experience. So I can't say when it comes to 20 millimeter, you can remove the drain. If the patient is immobilized, yes, when the patient in the bed, So you won't get, sometimes you can get when you examine the drain, it will be sometimes empty, but when the patient become mobilized, the secretion or the blood or serum comes into the drain. So you need to think about the volume, not only the volume, you have to use your own experience when you think about the removal of the drain.
What are the causes for post-operative pyrexia? How do you diagnose this and how do you manage the post-operative infection?
Yeah. This post-operative pyrexia, if you go read the literature, it says it is very common complication. But most of the time, the post-operative pyrexia, when you're talking about the pyrexia, we think it could be due to infection. But most of the time, it is due to not only the infection, but also due to many other causes. The most common cause is like head and neck surgeries, hemiglossectomy, neck dissection. It takes three or 4 hours. So because of this, patient immobilized for a prolonged period of time. So due to this, the patient breathing is not happening properly. So because of that, air accumulate in the lungs, and that causes the atelectasis. So that is the most common cause of pyrexia. So the second common cause is the pneumonia. If the patient is immobilized for a long time, and then the secretion collected in the lungs, and that can lead to pneumonia. So when you think about the major surgery, the other causes are patient can develop post-operative infection. If the patient is developing post-operative infections, so obviously you can detect by examining the wound. So you will see the erythema, tenderness, discharge. So by looking at those things, you can suspect patient will develop pyrexia. And if you do the investigation like WBC, DC count, and the CRP, you can detect it very clearly. So as a treatment for prevent the postoperative pyrexia due to this atelectasis and this going this patient into pneumonia, you should start early mobilization of the patients and encouraging them to have deep breath and introduction of the chest physiotherapy. By doing those things, you can prevent the pyrexia due to atelectasis and the pneumonia. So if you see any wound infections, so then you need to think about if you have not started any antibiotic preoperatively, especially in this patient, being a diabetic patient and the poorly controlled diabetic, so there's a risk of developing postoperative infection. So then what you have to do is, if you have already started the antibiotic, and then you have to, you can inform the microbiologist, and at the same time, you can think about taking soaps for culture and the ABST until the result comes, because the ABST and the culture and the ABST result, at least it will take 3 days. You can talk to the microbiologist and either continue the same antibiotic, or we can change to some other drugs. So other cause of postoperative pyrexia is DVT, deep vein thrombosis or pulmonary embolism. So deep vein thrombosis is a very common complication, especially when the patient become bedbound and patient become immobilized. Especially in this patient being a cancer patient, they are more risk to develop deep vein thrombosis. They say at least more than 45% of head and neck the patient, they develop asymptomatic DVTs, deep vein thrombosis. So because of this DVT, they can cause damage to the intima of the venous system. They produce various cytokines, and they can cause the pyrexia. So you need to think about the possibility of developing a deep vein thrombosis. So you can diagnose clinically, and you can do the D-dimer, so you can do the ultrasound scan. So by those things, you can diagnose the DVT. Sometimes even the asymptomatic stages, you can diagnose if you do some ultrasound scan. So then to prevent those things, the pyrexia due to DVT, either you have to continue the DVT prophylaxis, which has been started preoperatively, and continue them. At the same time, early mobilization, they say it can reduce DVT by 60%. There are other causes for the postoperative pyrexia. Alcohol withdrawal is one of the causes. And some drugs, especially some antibiotic itself and the heparin, if you have started for this patient as an anticoagulant postoperatively, also can cause postoperative pyrexia. So taking proper history and doing some investigation, and considering the pyrexia and the time, we can diagnose most of the causes for the pyrexia. Other thing is, after a major surgery, we insert the urinary catheter. Especially in the Sri Lankan, especially the cancer patient, their hygiene levels are very low. This catheter itself can introduce infection to the urinary system. They can end up with UTI. So if they develop UTI, they will complain the dysuria, fever, suprapubic pain, and urinary urgency. So diagnose this, you can do the urine analysis, urine pool report, and the culture. And if you contact the microbiologist, they will start the empirical antibiotic to prevent the complication of the urinary tract infection itself. So those are the few causes for postoperative pyrexia. If you are vigilant and if you have the proper history and the examination, and we will diagnose them early, and you can manage accordingly. But remember, the postoperative pyrexia, it is not infection all the time. There are so many other causes.
So I think we successfully discussed in the surgical and anesthetic point of view in the first case scenario. And
so I need to add something, Tanuja, into this DVT prophylaxis.
Yes.
So DVT prophylaxis, a type of prophylaxis, and the timing of prophylaxis. Sometimes in some, especially we were trained in UK, and UK, they even for the orthodontic surgery, as you know, they start even the compression stocking for the young patient even preoperatively. So most of the time, this the stocking can reduce more than 70% of the DVTs and the early mobilization of the patient. So I just want to highlight not only the medical treatment, the various other non-medical treatments play the major role in prevention of DVT.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Abesina. Can we go to the question session, and that your explanation is, then now it's over to Camilla. Please address the questions from the participants.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tanuja. We got 3 questions actually. One thing I suppose Dr. Abesina has explained. So one question is asking whether in the neck, are you going to place 1 drain, no 2 drains? So I think he explained for that question. And the other 2 just goes to, I think, for the anesthetist. If Dr. Abesina is willing to give the answers, we'll go ahead. Otherwise, what we can do is we can just put the answers in the WhatsApp group. So the first question is there any place for carbohydrate preload in head and neck surgery? If so, how to give the preload, and how it is going to be contraindicated in the diabetic patient?
I think, Camilla, I will not answer for that question. I will, if you want, then I will talk to the anesthetist and we'll get the answer, or the the nutritionist in our hospital, and then we need to find the way of sending this answer to the presenters here, participants. Nadina?
Yes, Dr. Abeysinga, we will do that. Thank you.
And the next question also goes to the anesthetist, I suppose. So the question is, what is the required preoperative target blood pressure for a patient? So that also.
Yeah, we'll ask from him, because he mentioned actually, but we will get the proper answer from him.
Okay, we'll do like that. We'll get those answers,
Yeah.
and we can post them in the WhatsApp group. Wouldn't we? Can't we?
Yeah,
yes,
I
Camilla.
don't think all the participants. Yeah, have you created any any other the WhatsApp group apart from the college one?
No, in the college one, no.
Yeah, then all the participants they won't be there in that group, right?
Yes, now we will.
No, we can forward it to the relevant groups, no problem.
We will entertain surgical related questions for this moment. Yes, please.
Yeah.
Up to now, those are the only questions we received.
We have 106 participants at the moment.
But only those questions. Only we have received those 3-4 questions.
Can you see your mobile phone that they will text you sometime?
Yeah. No, I got one there, and Dr. Kishan answered to that question earlier. In the absence of the questions, can we wind up?
Yes.
I'm Prasant here.
Yeah.
Nice presentation. Thank you. And
Thank you,
this is on behalf of the participants.
Yeah.
Can you, Majan, tell something about the wound care, post-operative wound care?
Yeah,
Some
I will-
people in the wards practically,
Yeah.
they ask simple questions like when to remove the sutures,
Yeah.
and whether it's okay to have a bath, or sometimes patients ask.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
the doctors ask from us. So sort of questions like that, common things.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
So ultimate aim of this wound care is to allow the say primary healing fast as possible, and then early mobilization, and send this patient home as early as possible. So this matter, not only the doctors and the nurses and the help from the patient and the carer also important. So if you think about the wound healing, so initially we need to inform the patient that this is what we are going to do. This is what you have to do. You have to maintain your hygiene and so many things, and the nutrition. And if you have the facility, then we can provide the leaflet and so many things. And if the patient is the elderly patient, whoever take care of this patient, also we need to inform what to do and when to do. And preoperatively, we have to think about allowing this patient to have a bath preoperatively, or the day that we are going to operate this patient. So there are various guidelines what to use, and what type of bath this patient should have, and how to decontaminate the nose, and so many things. So this has to be, the information has to be given to the patients and to the caregivers in the ward as well. So then if you think about another question that arises at the same time is the preoperative phase, the shaving. So as I mentioned earlier, so if the patient can have the nasal nasal decontamination, that is mucopericin, and the chlorhexidine bath, that is the best thing if you have the facility to allow them to have. So then post-operative, pre-operative shaving. It says in the literature, better not to use any sharp object. If you have the facility, then you have to use the elective shavers to shave this. And again, that also has to be done in the day of surgery, not before that. That prevents the wound infection. And then when you come to the theaters, and then you think about the sterility and the disinfection, not only the doctors and the nurses and the instrument and all the staff involved in this surgery. Theater staff, number of theater staff should be reduced, and then the movement of the sterile areas. This especially there's a minor staff people, they are wearing non-sterile gown and the things like that, and the movement of the number of patients and the amount of movement should be reduced. And then when you come to the antibiotic problem, the antibiotics, so the clean surgery, you don't need any antibiotic, and the contaminated wound, yes, you need to have antibiotic at the time of surgery or sometimes beforehand. Then we are talking about the wound dressing. Wound dressing, always it has to be the clean with normal saline. And when you are cleaning the wound, to prevent the bad scar formation, you have to be a little bit more gentle rather than just removing all the newly formed epithelium and using the betadine and the surgical spirit, especially the wounds like cleft lip. The 3-year-old baby, they are having very tender skin, so you have to be a little bit more gentle. And then post-operatively, when you are removing the dressings, then also you have to be very careful. Always you have to use the sterile gloves and then gown, and always you need to adhere to the antiseptic measures. It says in the literature, if you can have especially in the face and the head and neck region, post-operative bathing, it says even you can allow this patient to have a bath as usual after 48 days. So that helps dramatically to improve the post-operative scar. Prasanna, anything you want to add?
Yeah, that's Abhay, thank you very much. Yeah, and also the timing of surgery more, it all depends on the site and whether the type of the, sorry?
Yeah, the site of the wound and the tension that we have created.
Yeah.
So especially in the cleft lip patients, we remove suture between 5 to 7 days. Most of the time it is 7 days because we are getting another theater time after 1 week. It goes up to 7 days. So especially in the head and neck region, after neck dissection or neck dissections, normally it goes between 7 to 10 days. If the patient is having the features of wound infection, sometimes you can delay, you can do the intermittent suture removal, and you can delay for another 3-4 days to remove the rest of the sutures. And then as we are using the layering method, the possibility of wound adhesions and opening of the up of wound is also very low. So it says in the head and neck region, between 5 to 7 days, you can remove sutures, but then clinically you have to assess the wound and how it is healing and whether there's any infection ongoing in that area. Depending on those things, you can delay it. But normally it is 5 to 7 days, or you can delay it up to 10 days.
Thank you, Dr. Abesinger. Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Now, most of these patients will have urinary catheters.
Yeah.
Can you please explain how we can, when and how we are going to remove these urinary catheters? Thank you.
Yeah. So, especially after the head and neck surgery, especially the major surgery, like in our patient, hemiglossectomy and the neck dissection, most of the time we keep this patient 1 to 2 days in the ICU. During this ICU period, normally we keep the catheter intact. So as soon as possible, when the patient goes to the ward, normally they keep at least 10 to 12 hours at least, or 1 day in the HDU, high dependency unit.
Hello.
For some time, say maximum 1 day. So during that period, we can start mobilization of the patient. So as soon as patient is mobilized, better to remove the catheter. In our setup, normally what we do is theater, ICU, yes, we keep the catheter. So as soon as possible, when the patient comes to the ward, when the patient start mobilization, because this carries a lot of advantages: early mobilization, prevention of atelectasis, pneumonia, DVT, and so many things. And then the second day, most of the time, we remove the catheter. So when we decide to remove the catheter, so then we instruct the nurses to clamp the catheter, allow the bladder to get full of urine, and when the patient feel like he want to urinate, then we ask them to remove the catheter.
Okay, Dr. Abesinger, we have got a few questions.
Yeah.
One is, if the patient is, if you are planning for a reconstruction,
Yeah.
how to assess the donor site prior to surgery? And
Yeah.
if we are going for a prefab reconstruction, how frequently we have to check the vitality, and how we are going to check it, the correct method of checking the vitality.
Yeah. So first thing is the investigation of the donor site depends on type of the flap you are going to harvest. If it is the regional flap or the local flap or the microvascular flap, that depends on the type of flap you are going to harvest. For example, if you are going to harvest the peg major, so it is just a matter of just examination of the area. Sometimes, especially in the old age, you will see even the fungal infestation in those areas. So you need to improve the hygiene, not only doing this special investigation to assess the vascularity and so many things, because especially in the peg major flap, we don't do any special investigation as such to assess the vascularity. So on the other hand, if you go for the example radial forearm flap, there are some clinical tests. And then you need to assess the vascularity, radial artery and the ulnar artery properly before you harvest this flap. So that depends on the type of flap you are going to harvest. And then most of the flap is, unless the microvascular flap, we don't have any special investigation to assess the vascularity or whatever the thing in the flap, rather than having the just very good clinical examination to assess whether there's any laceration, possibility of damage to the feeding vessels, and whether you can have enough length of size of tissue in this area, whether there's any lesion in this area, especially in the female, and I don't know in the other areas in Sri Lankan setup in the state sector, their hygiene is very poor. But sometimes you need to improve their hygiene before doing this harvesting this type of flap. Otherwise, chance of failure is very high. I think the second part I can answer, but if you are going for the practical answer, Nadina will answer that question, because we don't do much microvascular flaps in our setup. I can give you the textbook answer, but Nadina will give you the practical answer in Sri Lankan setup. Nadina, can you answer that?
Thank you, Abesinger. Now, when we do a microvascular flap, the purpose of assessing is to save the flap if we find any issues. So it could be vascular compromise, either the artery or the vein. So if that is found out early, we can salvage the flap. So usually within the first 2 days, it's very important because we can salvage the vessels. So then we usually go for hourly assessment of the flap, and after that we can ease down the assessment. So it can be around 4 hourly for the next few days. And this depends on different institutions, but mainly the first 2 to 3 days are the most important, where we need to assess the flap very closely. So we check for the color, the capillary refill, texture, temperature, and the bleeding. And then if we have measures, then we can check with the Doppler as well. Hope that answered the question.
Thank you, Dr. Adina. There's another question. Please explain feeding of this patient post-operatively. So just the post-op feeding or the post-op nutrition.
Question goes to Dr. Abhay Singh.
Yeah. So feeding, as Krishan mentioned at the beginning, as soon as extubated, we allow some time, and then we can start with the clear fluid, and it depends. It depends. If the patient is need high protein diet, yes, we can start with the high protein diet. Anything that can be fed through the NG tube, you can start. So then it comes to how much you are going to feed. Normally, if the patient is not depending on any IV fluids, the daily requirements you can introduce through the NG tube. So then if the patient is need special requirements, say for example, the patient is requesting the high protein diet, yes, again, same thing. So this the number of feeds you can decide depending on the patient desire. Sometimes they don't want to have the feeding the huge amount at once. Then you can instruct them to have this, say, for example, 4 times, 6 times sometime. So that depends. Apart from that, I don't have any other idea than how whether they are saying restricted to feed this type of patient through the NG tube. But has to be given, then you can give through the NG tube.
Thank you, Dr. Abhay Singh. We got another question there. The question says, what are the other measures we can take to minimize the post-operative scarring?
Post-operative scarring.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. So then this, if you think about the, as everyone knows, you can't operate patient without scar. So there at least there will be a linear scar. So if you think about the cosmesis of this patient, you need to start from the very beginning. So even before you incise the skin, you need to think about you have to plan your incision. So for example, when you are making the incision, this incision should be right angle to the skin. Then you need to think about whether there's a possibility of including the incision line into the skin creases, and then RST lines, especially in the face RST line. You need to follow the RST line. If you go away, then with the wound contracture, and there's a possibility of making the scar much bigger. Apart from that, if at least if you can't go through the skin creases, you need to follow at least you have to run your incision. You should run parallel to the skin creases, especially when you are dissecting in the neck region, right? So then come to the while you are suturing. So while you are suturing, there are various type method of suturing. If you are really worried about, you can think about the very smaller suture, and then you have to think about whether they are going to be the resorbable, non-resorbable, whether you are going to subcuticular sutures. So apart from that, while you are holding the skin as well, so most of the time when you are holding the skin, we use the catch forceps, tooth forceps. So when you are handling the soft tissue, you have to be very gentle. Where if you use the catch forceps, it is this should not be used for the crush the tissue while you are holding the skin edges, and then you need to think about the type of needle you are going to use, whether it is cutting, taper cutting. It has to be very sharp, sharp needle, and then size of the needle, size of the thread, suture material, and how long you are going to keep this the suture there. So in the head and neck region, as I mentioned earlier, the earliest possible you have to remove this, and then we all know that there's going to be the at least minimum amount of scar tissue formation. So if you can do the layered method, use the layered method, that means the deep suture, 1 or 2 layers, and then the skin suture, you can reduce the tension of the wound edges. That ultimately helps to reduce the scar. And then there are various other methods of reducing the scars, like various medication used to soften the scar, prevent the contracture. There are so many other methods of preventing the bad scar. And then there are other group of people, not in, especially in the black people, so Africans. They have this possibility of developing the hypertrophic scar and the keloid. So in that type of patient, sometimes in even the Sri Lankan setup, some obese patient they are more prone to develop bad scar. So in that type of patient, the tissue handling should be more gentle than the rest of the people as well. So there are some preventive methods, some surgical tips you have to use, and post-operatively there are some medical methods to prevent this formation of the bad scar and the minimizing the improve the appearance of the scar. Kamila?
Thank you, Dr. Abhay. There's another.
Anything, Nadina, you can add?
Yeah.
Nadina?
No, Abhay, because of the limited time, we'll go for the next question. Thank you.
Yeah, there's another question. With the present COVID situation, do we wait for the OMF surgery with COVID positive patients? And if so, how long?
Can you repeat the question, Kamila?
With the present COVID situation,
yes.
Do we wait for the OMF surgery with COVID positive patients? And if so, how long?
So during this pandemic, we did all the cancer and the trauma patients without any delay, and even for the infection, especially the patient developed Ludwig angina, and the patient, especially children coming with the various sepsis, dental abscess, we operate everything. So all the routine surgeries as guidelines provided by the Ministry of Health, we delayed because if they can wait for some time, so we didn't operate anything. But now when the COVID situation is going down, we do the rapid antigen test for each and every patient, even for the suturing, biopsy and everything. So now we have started almost all the surgical procedures for the patient, because in the patient point of view, most of them having already completed their 2 doses of vaccination as well. So
Dr.
now I think, sorry.
Dr. Abhay, can I stop you there?
Yeah.
I think the question is, what is happening to patients who have COVID and post-COVID patients? So Can I answer this question?
Sure.
So one thing is, if a patient gets COVID at admission before the surgery, then we send the patient off. It happened to us one time. There was this 18-year-old boy with oral cancer. And when he was admitted, he got positive for COVID, and then he was sent off. And we got him back only 1.5 months, 1 month later. So I think the question is, what is the role of surgery once a patient has recovered from COVID? So that is the most important thing. So if the patient, there's a group of patients who can have post-COVID syndrome. They continue to have headaches and other memory loss and respiratory issues and things like that. So those patients will be at a higher risk of getting post-operative complications because they still continue to have side effects, but they are not having the active infection. And studies have shown post-COVID patients who undergo general anesthesia surgery can develop respiratory complications up to about 50-55%. So this we saw in our patient as well. So this 18-year-old boy, after he came back, we did the surgery about 1 month later, and he did have some respiratory complications. He went into pneumonia and he recovered completely. So there are post-operative complications that can happen when we put these patients to general anesthesia. And it will be higher risk if the patients are having post-COVID syndrome. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Adina. There's another question to Dr. Abesinghe. What is the protocol to start oral feeding? So I think you explained some part. So if you have anything to add on to this question, please go ahead.
So in this our patient, if you are thinking about starting oral feeding, yes, that is, you need to assess clinically, because this is the patient who underwent hemiglossectomy, and so because of that, function of the tongue, swallowing, speech can affect for at least for some time. So because of that, you need to start. Normally what we do in the clinical setup, normally at the presence of the NG tube, we say for example, after 7 days, if you see the wound healing is going in a proper direction, then you can start with some clear fluids at the beginning. You can just train. If you have the nutritionist or in your hospital, then you can assess the ability of swallowing for this patient, and you can get the opinion from them. Then they will start training the patient with various methods. If you don't have that facility, then you need to start with the clear fluid and start with small amount at the beginning, and gradually, as everybody knows, you can introduce the normal meal, say within another 1 or 2 weeks. But if you have the nutritionist, then you can get their opinion, and they will train. They will assess the ability of swallowing, and then they will train this type of patient gradually. So there's no hard and fast rule when to start. If you feel the wound healing is going in proper direction, yes, then you can start oral feeding for this type of patient, because early mobilization and minimizing the hospital stay, especially though it's the cost going to the government, but better to send this patient home as early as possible. That encourage the wound healing and becoming starting their routine works as usual as soon as possible.
Thank you, Dr. Abesinghe.
Yeah.
To wind up now, can I ask you this question? Now, it says that failing to plan is planning to fail. So in this pre-operative assessment and planning, with your personal experience, what have you or your team has experienced? You know, I'm sure that everybody has different issues happening. So is there any important thing that you want to tell so others can learn from any failure in planning or something like that?
Planning this type of patient for a major surgery, the most time that is a problem in communications.
Okay. And yes, as you said, I remember one colleague saying that there was a big problem with consent, because the patient has given consent, but sometimes the relatives, they don't know what kind of surgery. And cancer surgery, most patients don't come and they don't know what kind of surgery. They just consent, and we don't know whether they understand what we're going to do.
Yeah. And there's a time delay because of this poor understanding, especially in the state sector, language barrier. They will say, yes, I understand for everything, but nothing goes into their head. So because of that, because of this, the barrier, always there's a delay of operating this type of patients. Sometimes they come alone. When we are explaining to the patient, and then they want to talk to the family members, and they are far away, and that is what I have experienced. Not only this other preparation for the surgery, investigation, all the other facilities, though we have those things, that is the barrier, that is the most difficult thing we can't achieve in this side of patients. Level of understanding is very poor. So we try our best to let them understand these things, but most of the time, sometimes when this patient come to the next visit, they don't know where to go, what to do. Sometimes they have not gone for the relevant investigation. They are coming for the pre-medications. So that is the most difficult thing I have experienced while managing this type of patient. All the other things we can handle, but communication with the patients and their relatives are the most difficult part.
Yes, Dr. Abhising.
Yeah.
Yeah, you correctly said that communication is playing a major role here. And sometimes when you try to get the consent, and we are in a dilemma with what time, the amount of the detail that we give the patient to get the consent. Sometimes the information is more, and the patient at the end of the discussion of the information, at the end of the discussion, patient deny the treatment because of our information. And sometimes the amount, the adequate amount of information is somewhat it's difficult to define. And sometimes the patient says nodding the head and say agree, but they don't get enough information. Sometimes over information, and they at the end of the day they have gone out of the ward. So those things matter sometimes.
Dr. Abhising, since the time is a limiting factor, we'll go for, one question. There was a question regarding the steroid and antibiotic usage in third molar surgery. I think we have a separate session for this thing. So we, since that, we'll discuss those matters in that session. And there's one final question. If a COVID positive patient is admitted for an emergency surgery under general anesthesia, is there any special precautions to adopt for this patient? So
for the emergency surgery?
Yes, of course.
Yeah, that is, again, this is very clearly mentioned how to do, what to do if the patient is admitted for the emergency surgery. So once the patient is admitted, sometimes those guidelines say do this and that. Straight away, we need to, if it's a life-saving thing, We can't go for the PPE or anything else. We use the minimum precautions and they need to assess that. But as an OMF surgeon, we don't get that type of emergency, life-saving emergencies. But when the patient, if the emergencies comes to us, that is away from the life-saving, the airway, breathing. But sometimes you are called to the PCU when the trauma patient comes. Then always we use all the precautions which are given for the during management of the COVID patient. Sometimes you may not be able to wear the proper PE, but face mask and face shields, wearing at least the gown or the caps and boots you can use. But if you are straight away taking this patient into the theaters, if the patient is diagnosed patient with the COVID, then yes, we need to inform the theater first, and then you need to arrange the separate theater, or you need to postpone the other cases if it is an emergency surgery. And then we need to inform all the theater members, and we have to take all the precaution to spread of this infection within the theater. So once the theater session is over, as usual, we need to follow all the decontamination procedures that has to be done in the theaters. And then if you are planning this type of emergency surgery, yes, you need to inform all the staff that will involve in this type of surgery to take the maximum precaution as possible. When the surgery is performed, either this patient has to be sent to COVID ICU or to a separate ward where the facilities which are necessary for the management of this patient is available.
So I have a personal experience on this COVID positive patient present here.
Yeah.
The actually a patient following RTA admitted to the ward, and at the time of admission, that was done, it was negative. And because of the facial laceration and it needs suturing and suturing, they have done the PCR and it came as positive. By that time, entire staff was exposed to the patient as that was negative earlier. Then we had a problem whether to do the surgery or not, or if you are going to do the surgery, if it is under GA or local. Because again, PCR positive patient, COVID positive patient, if you do a GA procedures, the high chance of getting respiratory problems. So as you said, Abhisingha, I know most of the hospital, they have a separate system for the COVID patient management, the theater.
Yeah.
So with all the precautions, we had to do under local in the theater setup with minimizing the spreading of infection. Thank you.
I think questions are over. Dr. Kamila, shall we conclude?
Yeah, shall we?
Dr. Abesina, is it okay that
can I conclude? Yes, you can conclude.
On behalf of the college, let me conclude this saying thank you, Dr. Abesina and Dr. Krishan Rupasina, for your information, knowledge, and valuable time and valuable contribution to this event success. And it's my pleasure to thank all the participants. We would like to meet you in next month, and have a nice evening. Good night.
Small suggestions.
Yes.
I think Tanuja, it's better to get the feedback, if it is possible, from the participant to improve the next session, because this is the first time we are doing this, and definitely there could be some drawbacks. So then we can improve this.
Yes, definitely.
When it comes to the second one.
I'll send the message to the relevant group, then they can forward